Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the quarterfinals of the Speed Chess Championship, which is being held on chess.com. Now, for today's match, we have a very big matchup between Wesley So from the United States against the self-proclaimed future first American world champion Hans Niemann. Now, Hans pulled off a huge upset against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and today he's playing against Wesley, who I believe has only ever lost to both myself and Magnus Carlsen in the Speed Chess Championship format. All right, so the first game we'll be jumping into is the 7th game of the match, where the score is currently 4-2 in favor of Hans. Now, to set the scene for you guys, the match starts with I believe a 75-minute portion of 5 minutes plus 1 second increment. Hans got off to a very fast start, winning 3 of the first 4 games. Wesley clawed it back to 4-2, and now in this fateful 7th game of the match, with Hans leading by 2, Wesley has the white pieces. So let's jump into the action, and the game starts with the move e4. Here we get the move e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now we have bishop b5. Now, Wesley throughout this match pretty much only played the move 1 e4 and effectively played the Spanish and the Italian with bishop b5 and bishop c4. I will say a little bit more about that later on in this video, but in this game he plays the Spanish. We get bishop b5, knight to f6 from Hans, essaying the Berlin defense. We get d3, we have bishop c5, c3, castles. We get to move rook to e8, and here Wesley plays the move knight bd2. Hans plays a6, we get bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and now we have the move knight c4 being played. Here Hans plays knight to d7, and now we get the move rook to e1, and the game continues with bishop to f8. Wesley plays a4 here, trying to potentially stop black from playing b5 in this position, on top of simply taking some space on the queen side. Hans plays a5, and now we get the move d4 being played. We have pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and here white has a bit of a big center with these 2 pawns in the center, but the game is very dynamic as black has the pair of b's. So we get the move knight to b6. Wesley decides to trade the knights, and now he plays h3, a nice move stopping bishop to g4, which would attack the knight which guards the pawn, and additionally creating some lift for the king to escape to h2. We get the move bishop to e6, and now he has a move queen c2, and here we have h6 being played by Hans. Wesley plays bishop to d2, we get queen to f6, and now we have this move rook to e3 being played. Hans plays rook d8, and we get the move bishop c3. Now at this point, Wesley has a small advantage here because he's a big white center with these 2 pawns on d4 and e4. He has the bishop on a nice diagonal, and additionally this rook on e3 can potentially swing over to g3 if this long diagonal ever opens up for the bishop. So Hans plays queen g6, we get king to h1 here, and now the move bishop d6 being played. Wesley plays knight to e5, and now Hans goes queen h5. Here Wesley plays f4, trying to overprotect the knight on the e5 square, and we have this move f5 being played. Now, one thing that I noticed very early on in this match, which did not bode well for Wesley, is that Hans was playing some moves that were maybe not the best moves, but creating big imbalances in the positions. Now, you may be wondering, what do I mean by imbalances? What I mean is that these are positions where it's not a 2-result game. It's not a situation where you can either draw or win the game, more or less dry endgame style stuff. It's very tactical, very sharp, and in my opinion, Wesley never really reacted to this very well throughout the match. So we get the move g4 being played here. We have pawn takes pawn. We get this move f5, and here Hans finds a spectacular shot with this move c5. Now I know on my analysis board it's not giving this a double x-slam, but this was a fantastic move that Hans found in the game because the position's getting very chaotic here with basically the white king being loose on the king side. White has this big center. There's a knight. The rook's coming over. It's very, very chaotic, but c5 is a fantastic move. So the reason it's a fantastic move is that if white takes what looks like a free bishop, after takes, bishop takes e5, let's just say takes, suddenly the white king is still open, but with all the pieces coming up in the middle of the board here, the pawns on e6 and e4 are extremely weak. So Wesley ends up taking on c5. We get takes, bishop to f7, and now we have the move bishop c3, and here Hans plays this move g5. Now g5 is a very big mistake in the position, but with the players not having 10 years to think, or literally 20 minutes I should say, this is not a classical game or even rapid. It's very hard to figure out what the best line is. The computer actually suggests this great rook sacrifice with rook takes e4, sacking the rook, and after rook takes rook, queen takes h3. If you block with queen h2 here, black can play bishop to d5, and after takes, and rook to e1, there's rook e8, winning back the rook on e4. But Hans plays the move g5. Now, another thing that I noticed in this game, also some of the games that preceded this and the games later, is that if you look at the clock situation, Wesley is very low on time already here. He is down 1.5 minutes. Now, I dare say when you look at this game, for a second, you probably think, wait, is this Hans playing or is this Nepo playing? Because Nepo is the one player who does tend to build up these very big advantages on the clock, but nonetheless, it is Hans. So after g5, we have this move queen g2, a great move from Wesley, and here we have the move bishop to d5 being played. Wesley plays rook a e1, protecting the rook on e3 and guarding the pawn on e4. Hans goes bishop c6, and now we get this move queen takes g4, which is a fairly serious mistake. Now, what I mentioned about 1 minute ago is that I felt these positions, they're very dynamic, and while white is doing very well, it's not in Wesley's style. Wesley really likes drier positions where he can only win or draw that are very technical versus the very sharp tactical situations, and this is a perfect example. If Wesley were to play this move king to g1, dodging this pin on the h file, white would actually be close to winning here, because if black takes on h3, after rook takes h3, queen has no squares available. You go back to f7, rook takes h6, there's queen g5 coming in the position, there's also rook h8 checkmate threats, and the game is simply over. But Wesley plays this move queen takes g4 relatively quickly. Hans trades, and here we get a big shocker when Hans makes a huge mistake by taking the pawn on c5. What Hans should have played here was this move rook takes e4, and after rook e4, rook e8, it's very similar to the other variation I showed you guys where the rook on e4 will be lost. After takes, rook e4, takes, king h2, bishop c2, takes. White has one extra pawn on b6, but effectively in this position, and I'll just set it up, you end up in a situation here where the players will yo-yo with their bishops. The opposite color B's here means that the game will end in a draw. So we get b takes c5 instead. Wesley plays king h2, and now Wesley has reached an endgame where, due to these central passed pawns on the e and the f files, white should be winning. Hans plays bishop a4, Wesley takes, we get rook d4, bishop c3, rook c4, and now the move king g3 where white is trying to push the e pawn. Hans plays bishop c6, we get this move e5 here, now we get h5 being played, takes, rook f4 I should say, and now we have the move f6. Now notice from the evaluation bar, white is completely winning. You have the white peepos here on the f, the e, and the h files. There's also an open d file here, so Wesley should win the game. We get rook to e6, we have rook d1, now we get bishop e8, rook d6 being played, bishop f7, and now we have rook e d3. One point I want to mention very briefly is that here black could play the move rook takes pawn, because if you take, you lose the rook, and if you take the rook, black can take back, and white is only very slightly better. Instead, we get bishop f7, rook d3, we have rook e4, now we get h6 here, and Wesley is completely winning. Hans plays move king h7, we get rook to d7, king g6, and here we get this very surprising move rook to e7. Now, I was completely shocked by this move from Wesley's standpoint, because Wesley, I was expecting to sack the rook with rook takes, bishop takes, and now h7 here. And after, say, rook to h4, there's rook d7 check. If you go king e8, there's rook g7, followed by rook to g8, and h8 equals queen, and white wins the game. And if black goes this way, after check, king f5 and f7, once again, the white pawns are simply rolling up the board. So Wesley should be winning. Instead, Wesley plays this move rook to e7, which still should be good enough, but now after takes and king takes h6, while white is winning here, it's going to require a little bit of work. So we get the move rook to d8, Hans plays b5, and now we get this move rook f8, king g6, and here the move e8, queen is played, and this is an epic mistake from Wesley. All of this is completely unnecessary here. If you're really going to try to reach this endgame, you should simply queen right away, because now the king is on h6. It's one square further away from the center of the board. So Wesley goes rook f8, we get king g6, queen takes. Now we have b4, bishop d2, and we get this move rook to e2 being played. Now, the way for white to actually continue winning the game is a very counterintuitive move, rook to e6 here, because after king f7, you can now go rook f6, king e7, and you have a very important move here, which is king to f3, targeting the rook on e4. Now, the reason this is winning is black cannot go rook to f4. The rook covers a square, and after rook h4 and bishop d2, white has two pawns on the board. The g pawn is falling, and white should be able to use the rook, the bishop, and the pawn to win the game. Instead, Wesley, also just to point out, reason Wesley cannot go king f3 here right away, by the way, is then rook f4 check would win this bishop on c3. So we get bishop d2, rook to e2 is played, we have rook d8, and now we get the move rook takes e5. Here Wesley goes king g4, we get rook e4, king f3, rook e5, and now we have the move bishop e3 being played. we get to move king to f5, and now we have rook f8, and here Hans plays the move king to e6. Now, one thing that's from the very start of the match all the way through that was clear is Wesley was simply not very sharp, because after king to e6 here, if Wesley simply goes rook to e8, king here, trade, bishop takes pawn, b3, king g4, let's just say king e4, black can bring the king down, but the bishop anchors here on a3 guarding the pawn, and white will eventually be able to just run the king all the way over and gobble his pawn and win the game. Now, Wesley is a phenomenally strong player, but it's very clear that he was simply missing these basic tactics. Instead, he goes rook to g8, and now we get king d5. We have bishop takes pawn, king c4, and at this point, the game should be a draw for a couple of reasons. The single biggest reason is because if black can ever trade off the pawns, I'm just going to illustrate the reason here. Just ignore it, you guys. You get some position like this where it's rook and a bishop versus rook. This is a theoretical draw where white cannot win. So after king to c4, black should be able to exchange these two pawns here in return for this one pawn on b2. Wesley goes bishop f4, we get rook d5. Here we have rook g2. Now we get to move king b3. Wesley plays king e4, check, king e3, rook d7, bishop e5, c4, king e4, and here Hans plays the move rook to d3. Now we get rook to e2, rook h3, bishop d4, and the move c3 is played. Now, Hans has played excellently in his endgame, basically to reach a position where it should be a draw after pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn. But will Wesley make the draw? Wesley decides to go king d5 here, and this is a very, very surprising move in my opinion. At this point, black is pushing the pawn down the board. You simply have to make the draw with something like rook e3, takes, c2, and king d3. And at some point, you sack the bishop for the pawn, and the game becomes a draw. Instead, we get king d5. Now there's c2, rook c1, and after rook to d3, suddenly Hans is on the right side of this position as he's going to play rook d1 and try to create a queen on c1. We get to move rook c1, rook d1, takes, and now the move king c4. At this point, it's a rook versus bishop endgame, and it should be a draw. Now, what a turn of events. Wesley was completely winning. If Wesley wins this game, it would have been 4-3 going into the 3+1 segment, but now he has to defend this endgame with only seconds on the clock. Get rook h1, bishop c5, and I'm not going to really go through all the moves here, but Wesley heads to the right corner with the king on a8 here. We get the move king b6, and now inexplicably Wesley plays this move bishop to b8, which loses on the spot. What Wesley had to do here was keep the bishop on a square like f4, because if black ever checks, you can block with the bishop. If black checks this way, you can slide over, and after rook to f5, you check the king away, and then you stay in this corner where the bishop can guard the king. Instead, Wesley plays the move bishop b8, and now after rook to a5 check, white is going to lose the bishop. Bishop a7 is the only legal move to keep the game going, and after rook takes a7, Wesley resigns the game here, and Hans takes a commanding 5-2 lead into the 3+1 portion. Now, this game was very, very shocking to see, because from the start, it seemed like Wesley had a small advantage. He finally got into a technical endgame, which he should have been winning, but he made some very uncharacteristic blunders, and Hans, on top of being able to turn it from a loss into a draw, then turns it from a draw into a win, and this makes it a 1-point margin. So next game we're going to be taking a look at is this game between Hans with the white pieces and Wesley with the black pieces. Now we're fast forwarding a little bit. The current score is 6.5 to 4.5 in favor of Hans. Wesley on a little bit of a heater. He, after losing that game and being down 5-2, I believe he lost another game to go down 6-2. So he was down for 1-2 games with a draw. And at this point, he's down 6.5, 4.5. He's down 2 points. And let's take a look at the game. So with Wesley on a big heater here, he's trying to come back. We get Hans playing the classic Italian opening. Now, I'm not able to go through all the games from this match, but it's very clear that from the get-go, Hans's preparation in the Italian for this match, but just in general, was vastly superior to what Wesley came in with. I don't think Wesley did preparation before the match. I think he thought that he could simply play his systems and he'd be fine, but he got outplayed in the opening in many of these Gucci pianos. So we get knight f6, d3, bishop c5, Hans castles, we get castles, c3. Now we have the move d6, h3, bishop b6, a4, and now we get to move a5. Hans plays knight d2, Wesley goes knight to e7, and now we get the move d4 being played. Wesley decides to trade the pawns on d4, and now he plays this move knight takes e4. Now this is a temporary sacrifice, but after knight takes e4 and d5, black is pressuring both the bishop and the knight here. Now I believe the computer gives white a small advantage after knight f6 takes and bishop d3 due to the slightly weakened black kingside pawn structure, but Hans instead decides to play the move bishop d3. We got takes, and now we have the move bishop f5. Queen d3 is played. Wesley trades the bishops, and here he plays this move c6. Now at this point, if Wesley were to play the move rook to e8 here, followed by knight to d5, black has a very, very pleasant position here because you have the isolated pawn, which is blockaded by the horse on d5. And it's not as though this is like winning or anything for black, but after bishop d2 and c6, black is slightly better because of this pawn. Instead, Wesley goes c6. We got to move rook to e1. And now Wesley blunders horribly with this move rook to e8. What Wesley needed to do is play knight d5, and after bishop g5, queen to d7 perhaps, or even f6 for example, bishop d2 and queen d7. Black is a little bit better. It's not winning or anything, but black is in almost no danger here with this isolated pawn on d4, which white will have to defend for the whole game. Instead, Wesley plays the move rook to e8, and now after bishop g5, as you guys can tell from the evaluation bar, Wesley So is lost after 18 moves, barely out of the opening, completely lost because of this pin on the knight here, and we get this move queen d7 being played. Now, if Wesley were to play f6, which is surely his initial intention, after queen e6 and king to h8, white can sack the bishop here, pinning the knight on e7, and after takes king g8 and knight to g5, white is threatening mate on f7. The h7 pawn is weak. Rook f8 dodges mate, but after takes, white simply has extra pawns here. After knight f3, takes, and rook b1. Let's just say bishop g7, rook b7. White has one extra pawn, 3 connected on the king side, and white should be winning. Instead, Wesley goes queen d7. We get bishop takes knight, bishop to d8, and now the bone crusher knight to g5, threatening mate on h7. And here Wesley resigns the game immediately. Now, the reason Wesley resigns, if you go h6, queen h7 is simply checkmate, and if you go g6, I have queen to h4, pressuring the pawn on h7. But now after h5 stopping mate, I trade the bishops here, and after takes, and rook d8, white simply has an extra knight and will win the game. So Hans wins this game right out of the opening to take a 7.5 to 4.5 lead. Wesley had a lot of momentum, it felt like, but then he loses this game. And the next game we're going to take a look at, we're not starting from the very beginning, is the exact next game where it's 7.5, 4.5, and Wesley has the white pieces. Now, we're going to start this game from fairly deep in the game because we don't want to go through every game from the start. But we're going to get this critical position right here after knight e5, king e6, and knight d3. Now let's take stock of the position. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4. White is up 2 pawns and should be winning. So we get king d5, knight f4 check being played. If black captures a pawn, there's knight to e6, forking the king and the rook and winning the game. So we get the move king to e4. Now we have g3 being played by Wesley. We have bishop to f6. We get the move rook to e1. Here we have king f5, and now the move knight e6 is played. Hans plays the move rook to d7, trying to pressure this pawn on d4, and Wesley finds the best move in the position, which is g4. Hans goes king g6 here, and now Wesley plays this move rook to e4. As you guys will notice in this position, white can go knight to f8 here, forking the king and the rook and winning the game. But Wesley goes rook e4. He still has 2 extra pawns here. Should be a pretty clean win, right? Should be. He's a top 10 player, or he has been for at least the last decade plus. So we get king f7, f4, g6, we get king g2, rook e7, f5, takes, rook d7, king f3, rook d5, king f4, guarding the pawn on f5. Everything is guarded here. And now we have bishop e7. Rook e5 is played. We get rook d7, king e4, bishop f6, rook d5. Hans cannot trade the rooks here as white simply has 2 extra pawns. Actually, no, I had it wrong in my head. I thought he played rook e7. Hans does trade the rooks, and now he goes bishop to h4. As you guys can tell, I do this on the fly, and now we get to move king c4. So Hans plays king f6. We get this move d5, and now we have the move king takes f5 being played. Wesley plays knight to d4, and now we get this move king to e5 being played. Now, black is losing here after king to e4. There's, I believe, d6, bishop to d8, c6, takes, knight guards the pawn, and after the bishop moves, you go d7, you make a queen, let's just say king to f3, queen, takes, king here. I believe knight c6 takes, knight b4, I think you're in time here, takes, h5, you go here, h4, a6, h3, a7, h2, a8, queen, and white wins the game. So we get knight d4, and Hans plays king e5. And here Wesley plays this move d6, missing for a second time in the game a very basic knight fork with knight to f3, which simply wins on the spot. If Wesley plays knight f3, he wins this game. He's already had at least 3 chances to win, but instead he goes d6. And now after bishop d8, suddenly black is completely fine because white is up a pawn, but the extra pawn can easily be captured on a5. This king is very close to the central pawns that are going up the board, and now white no longer is winning. So Wesley goes c6, we got takes, bishop c7, knight b3, king c6, knight c5, bishop d6, We get knight e4, we get a little bit of repetition, takes, king b7, now we have the move king b5, h5, knight c5, and Hans correctly trades the bishop for the knight here, goes king a6, and at the end of the day, black's king is able to get all the way over to f8, g8, and h8, and the game is going to end in a draw in this final position. So another example of where Hans is completely lost. Wesley misses multiple opportunities to create the forks and win, and it shows the resilience both of Hans's defense in general, but how out of form Wesley seemed to be throughout this match. So the very last game we're going to take a look at, I'll keep this fairly light, is with the score being 8-6. This is the final game of the 3-1. These last 3 games have happened in a row with Wesley having the white pieces. He's down by 2 points here. He has to win this game if he wants to have a chance in bullet. So here we get the move e4. Once again, we get another Spanish. I was very critical of Wesley throughout the match when I was doing my live commentary on my Kick channel, because Wesley never deviated. He kept playing e4 on move 1 and playing either the Spanish. I think he might have played a couple of Italians, but almost exclusively playing the Spanish or the Italian in this match. And that is a big mistake, because if your opponent is very comfortable and they're doing well in these openings, you're basically throwing away any potential advantage you have. So we get another Ruy Lopez Berlin. I'll just fast forward a little bit. We get to this position right here where black plays d5. Now there's a lot of chaos going on here in the center of the board. You have the big black center versus the white pawns on d3 and e4. White is also trying to open up the a file potentially, so there's a lot of potential for both sides. Wesley plays bishop b2. We get d4, queen c1, takes, and now we have the move queen d6 being played. Here Wesley plays move a takes b5 after a nearly 35-second thing. Now I've already spoken about some of the opening mistakes Wesley made and the fact that he wasn't on form, but another thing I noticed that was surprising is Wesley was extremely slow throughout this match. Wesley was very slow. There were many games where he had seconds on the clock, and as I mentioned during my live commentary, Wesley is not a player who's considered to be the best when he has seconds on the clock versus an opponent who might have 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes. The one player who is very good at that is Alexander Grischuk from Russia, but Wesley ended up in many situations like this, and this is another example of where Wesley probably not feeling very confident. He spends a bunch of time, whereas he should have spent 5 to 10 seconds deciding between taking on b5 or playing queen to b2. Instead, he spends 30 seconds before trading. We get the trade of the rooks, queen to b2. Now we have rook e8, and here Wesley plays the move g4. Now this is a big mistake from Wesley because Hans correctly sacks the bishop here, and after takes, you'll notice that so many of White's pieces, sort of this mini pyramid or 3x1, I guess you could call it. All these white pieces are very far away from this king on g1, and White is actually in a lot of trouble. So Wesley goes rook to e2. We got this move queen g6 being played. And here we have the move king to f1. Hans plays queen to h5. We get the move king to g2. And now we have rook e6 being played. Hans trying to lift the rook to the king side and checkmate the white king. Wesley plays the move queen to a2, which is a mistake here. Again, Wesley very unconfident throughout the match, but if he does play queen to a1 here, threatening the ice skater checkmate with queen a8. After h6 here, White has queen to h1, challenging the queen on h5. And after knight e3 takes, rook g6, White can move this knight to block, and after takes and rook g3, black is still much better in this position after king h3, but White temporarily at least has one extra bishop and won't lose immediately. So after rook to e6, we get queen a2 instead from Wesley. Now the queen cannot go to h1, so after h6 is played, even though you have this check on a8, without the queen being able to swing over to h1, it's simply GG, why not? We get to move bishop b3. Hans plays rook to f6, guarding the pawn on f7 and keeping massive pressure towards the pawn on f2 and also pressure towards the h2 square. We get to move bishop d5. Now we have knight to e7. Here comes the knight to g6 and f4, g6 and h4, and White is just getting absolutely crushed. Wesley plays knight to f1. We get rook takes f3 here. Hans sacks the rook. This isn't the only way to win, by the way. Knight g6 also is probably good enough with something like this. Knight g3, check, and then queen h3, and suddenly there's a mate on g2. But rook takes f3 is very stylish. So we get knight g3 being played. If White were to play king takes h3 here, there's queen h3 check, knight g3, and it's spaghetti-o, knight to h2 checkmates this white king. There are no squares available. So we get knight g3 instead. Hans sacks the rook for a second time. We get takes, knight to e3. Now this isn't, of course, the absolute cleanest way to win, but at the end of the day, it's still winning, and with simplified material on the board and the weakened white king here on g2, black will win. Wesley goes bishop b3. We get knight to c6. Knight trying to jump to d4. We have this move queen to a8, king h7, and here Wesley grabs his horse on c6. Now, of course, at this point the game is over anyway, but Wesley lets Hans finish in style with queen to e2, king h3, check, king g4, and now the move h5 is played. And here Wesley takes, and after queen to h3 the game ends in checkmate. If you go king h4, it's the same problem. Queen to h1 would be mate, as the king has no squares available. So Wesley loses this game as well, the final game of the 3+1 portion. That means that Hans goes into the 1+1 portion with a 3-point lead. Now, I believe the final score when all was said and done was 12-10. I could be wrong on that. I believe that Hans started off very well. He won the first couple of games. Then in the garbage time, it's winding down. Wesley won a few to make the score look somewhat respectable. But nonetheless, Hans does win the match by a score, I believe, of 12-10. It might have been 13-10, not 100% sure. And moves on to the semifinal, where he will face either Magnus Carlsen or Arjun Erigaisi. Now, very, very shocking result, of course, but at the end of the day, it's very clear that Hans was pretty steady. He defended, he kept the games going when it mattered, and Wesley's technique was simply not there. There were many cases where Wesley had a chance to win games and he wasn't able to do that. So at the end of the day, if you don't capitalize on your opportunities, you don't deserve to win. So Hans wins this match, a second big upset in a row, and we will eagerly await and see whether Hans faces Magnus or if he'll face Arjun. We'll get a fourth time. There's the fifth time where Hans does not play, or where Magnus does not play Hans. Who knows, but we wait and see. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the quarterfinals of the Speed Chess Championship being held on chess.com. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I'll be back with some more recaps in the coming days. See you guys. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.